First item on the agenda this morning is Council and Commission statements, increased terrorism threat. I'll first of all give the floor to Minister Bert Koenders on behalf of Council. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, honourable members. On this occasion, 10 weeks after the Paris terrorist attacks, I would like to be able to say that most probably we will never again witness such a heinous attack in Europe. Unfortunately, I'm not convinced that this is true. On the contrary, judging from recent events, the terrorist threat seems to be increasing in the European Union, but also in its vicinity and further afield, as the recent attacks in Istanbul, Jakarta, Ouagadougou, in Kharshada, Pakistan have shown. As Presidency, we will do anything with our powers to improve the Union's capacity to counter this threat and to protect our citizens. In this context, counter-terrorism will be a key topic at the informal meeting of the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers next week in Amsterdam. The Presidency also attaches great importance to the rule of law and to getting the balance right in this respect in the fight against terrorism. Obstacles to information exchange on foreign terrorist fighters and ways forward to clear these obstacles will be first and foremost on the agenda. Another issue that we will address is information sharing between Member States on firearms and explosive precursors. Implementation of the measures agreed is key, as indicated in the EU Internal Security Strategy 2015-2020. The Heads of State and Government statement on counter-terrorism on 12 February 2015, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, remains the framework the European Union needs to implement urgently as called for by the European Council. You can be assured that the Presidency will spare no effort to promote rapid progress in its implementation. Progress has been made over the past months and has been set out in a public report by the European Union Counter-Terrorism Coordinator in late November. Information sharing and operational cooperation are top priorities identified by the Council. Progress has been made. The agreement on the European Union PNR directive will support police and intelligence agencies in tracking down possible terrorists and criminals by accessing travel details of passengers. On the 1st of January, Europol launched the European Counter-Terrorism Centre. This is a more robust platform through which Member States can increase information sharing and operational coordination. This includes the monitoring and investigation of foreign terrorist fighters, as well as the trafficking of illegal firearms and terrorist financing. In November 2015, Member States committed to seconding CT experts to the ECTC to form an enhanced cross-border investigation support unit. Europol is actively engaged in support of ongoing CT investigations in several Member States. Progress of contributions to the various EU databases is being monitored and discussed in the Council. Outside the European Union context, cooperation and information sharing among security services will be stepped up in the context of the counter-terrorist group, CTG. And the Commission will soon present its proposal on updating the European Criminal Records Information System for the systematic sharing of criminal records data for people connected to terrorism. Furthermore, we have started discussing the proposal to amend the framework decision on combating terrorism. On the 2nd of December, the Commission presented a draft directive with a view to collectively implement United Nations Security Council Resolution 2178 and the additional protocol to the Council of Europe Convention. Negotiations on this directive are already underway and we hope to be in a position to achieve an agreement in June this year. Apart from enhancing the exchange of law enforcement information, countering radicalization and recruitment remains a priority. An EU approach is needed, taking into account that over 5,000 citizens have left to fight for terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria. Concerning integration and non-discrimination, we should create opportunities for all. We should do much more on tolerance and anti-Muslim hatred, further interreligious dialogue, and communicate our values. Education is key, and we look forward to Commission initiatives in this context. But prevention alone is not enough. The return of well-trained, radicalized individuals poses a genuine security threat. At the European Union level, the main tool we have for sharing best practices is the Radicalization Awareness Network. This network has made impressive strides in recent months, facilitating the flow of best practice and expertise between member states. It can also begin to share expertise with third countries. Immediate focus here will be the Middle East and North Africa region and Turkey. It is a fact that the internet is one of the primary channels for radicalization, publishing and proliferating illegal content. The establishment of an internet referral unit within Europol's counter-terrorism center has improved our ability to obtain the removal of terrorist threats. On the 3rd of December 2015, the EU Internet Forum was launched. The objective is to identify and to remove terrorist content, and to develop effective counter-narratives. Cooperation with the providers in this context obviously is important. The discussion of the Commission's proposal for an EU action plan against illicit trafficking in and use of firearms and explosives have begun. The Presidency aims to reach a general approach on this new proposal. Finally, I'd like to mention the border police package, which is also important in the context of the fight against terrorism, as we have to strengthen controls at the EU's external borders. Border security is another top priority under our presidency. On this issue, one should of course be careful mixing migration and terrorism. We cannot turn our eyes away from the threat, but let's not forget that the vast majority of migrants are fleeing situations of conflict and even fleeing from terrorism themselves. The close cooperation with key partners, such as the United States, is continuing. Furthermore, we will continue strengthening our counter-terrorism engagement with partners in North Africa, the Middle East, Turkey and the Western Balkans. Let me conclude by saying that I think we all share the same objectives. Among other things, this has been demonstrated by your resolution of February last year on anti-terrorism and the reports adopted by Libe at the end of last year. We look forward to a fruitful cooperation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Minister Koenders. And now I'm asking Commissioner Avramopoulos to take the floor for the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members of the Parliament, Minister Koenders, welcome. As you all know, 2015 has been a turning point in Europe's experience on terrorism. Terror has claimed the lives of 150 innocent citizens, innocent people. Too many lives lost and too many lives scared. We have to be realistic. The terrorist threat in the European Union is high. The terrorist threat is there. We are determined to respond with resolve and resilience, and at the same time to uphold our values of tolerance, democracy and respect of fundamental rights. From day one of this Commission, we stressed that combating terrorism was a common European responsibility. Our European agenda on security is on the table, as you know, since last April. We have drastically accelerated its delivery with the political agreement on EU PNR, the proposal for a directive on terrorism, the November firearms package, the action plan on firearms trafficking, the Europol regulation adopted in December, the reinforced RAN Centre of Excellence to counter radicalisation, and the launch of the EU Internet Forum to counter harmful content online. And just this week, the proposal to exchange the criminal records of non-EU nationals. These are all tangible measures to strengthen our security across borders, and more is coming. 2016 will be the year where we go after terrorist money. We need to deprive terrorists of their financial resources. In early February, we will put our ideas forward with a concrete timetable. Our borders package of last December is also a critical piece of the puzzle because it will allow the systematic security check of all people living and entering the European Union. It is clear that we need to improve the management of our external borders in order to enhance internal security and safeguard Schengen. I want to be clear, once again, on a related point. Refugees crossing our borders because they need international protection and they are entitled to international protection are not terrorists. I want to reaffirm that we will never equate refugees with terrorists. We cannot and we must not fear to prevail. Let me finally turn to information sharing. This is a sensitive, but as you understand, very crucial issue. As you know, it is one of the central pillars of our security agenda. The EU tools are there to facilitate the exchange of information between national law enforcement authorities. The Schengen Information System, Europol's databases, the PRUM framework, they should be used to the maximum by the Member States. Member States need to trust each other more. They need to share more information between themselves and also with Europol. Law enforcement authorities across Member States, including specialised law enforcement agencies, we all work for the same purpose: the security of our citizens. We need to understand that collectively we are all safer. The threats we face are common. Our approaches to the threats need to be common too. This is not a competition. We reinforce each other if we cooperate. Information is already being exchanged at various levels, but we need more of it, not less. Next week, we will officially launch the European Counter-Terrorism Centre at Europol. It has been operational since January 1st, 2016. This centre can become the hub of our counter-terrorism operations if we make the best use of it and if Member States share information. This centre can only succeed in its mission if we all help it to succeed. The support provided by Europol to French and Belgian investigators after the Paris attacks is the best example of the role that the European Counter-Terrorism Centre could play. Cross-checking data, facilitating information sharing, and providing analytical and operational assistance to the national services on the ground. Honourable members of the Parliament, 1 year ago, following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we stressed that our response would not be dictated by fear, or driven by hasty conclusions. The Commission proposed several concrete actions which are part of a comprehensive approach, and in this collective effort we have made progress. But recent events remind us that we still need to do much more. Now is the time to act and to strengthen our cooperation. Let's make 2016 a turning point for Europe to tackle terrorism decisively, head-on, in all its aspects. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And now I'm asking Madam Vozemberg.
Signora Vozemberg, għal żewġ minuti.
Thank you very much, President. Today,
ότι φωτογραφίζοντας και δημοσιεύοντας τις φωτογραφίες.
there is an article which states that the lessons from the Paris attacks should be lessons for everyone. There are photographs of the terrorists who carried out the Paris attacks, and I think apparently that's what they're saying, is that's supposed to be the basis for an anti-terrorism policy, but that can't be the way we work. The EU is based on the rules and principles of democracy. We don't base ourselves on sensationalism. Today, Europe knows that 5,000 Europeans are terrorists. But how can we actually intervene? What has the European Union, what has the Council done? I mean, we have actually taken several steps forward. And I don't think we can ensure that fear becomes all pervasive. I mean, how can we try and control this phenomenon? There are various groups, there are networks, they have goals, targets, and they relate to human lives. They're trying to get us to shut down, to close our borders, etc. I mean, the policies that we are carrying out are correct, I think. I mean, you can't say that refugees and terrorists are the same thing. I mean, okay, we do have to be aware that there are some terrorists crossing over with the refugees, but they're certainly not the majority. So these two phenomena certainly can't be linked. We can't link migration and terrorism. We have to be very careful here. We have to try and see what we can do to control what's going on, using the internet, using cooperation between member states, and using cooperation with third countries. That is how we have to act, because terrorism does have a face. It has a terrible face, and our response needs to be more democracy.
Mr. Jurek has a blue card question. Do you accept, madam?
Mr. Jurek. Mike.
Sorry.
Oh, okay, it works.
Thank you very much. Both in your words and in the words of Commissioner Avramopoulos, there's a lot of truth and valuable comments. We should not be combining immigration with terrorism or support for terrorism and support for terrorism with terrorism itself. But do you not see the fact that if we see numerous millions of Muslims in Europe, this is the background for the development of terrorism in Europe? This is a European phenomenon. It is not an imported one.
Colleague, I don't think we should link the two phenomena. We need to have a strategy that controls the external borders of the European Union, and the European Union's working on that. We cannot base our strategy simply on stopping people who want to come in from doing so. That's not something we can do. We need to base ourselves on the values and principles of the European Union in welcoming these people.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Ms. Sippel.
Thank you very much. Terrorist attacks over the last month in Europe and elsewhere are not targeted at specific people. The objective is to spread fear and thus destroy freedom and democracy. And Clearly, we've got to be against terrorism and we have to defend our free society. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the terrorism we're seeing at the moment is not a national phenomenon, and therefore existing European tools for investigation and for prevention of terrorism must be used better. That includes getting rid of terrorist propaganda on the internet, to remove illegal content and find the perpetrators. We have to counter the money of terrorists, and we've got to counter radicalization in Europe through integration and through all-encompassing advisory programs. We have to arrest and prosecute perpetrators. We need to have appropriate judicial systems. There must be no rooms, there should be no spaces which are lawless. We must have proper digital investigation, and it must be done in due time. European-wide, we must have the same definitions for terrorist actions and other crimes. The Commission has made a proposal on this. And fair procedures must also always be guaranteed, so that procedures don't, or so that cases don't fall because of insufficient proof. So we need to prevent and prosecute. We must use all instruments of the state based on law, on the rule of law. Only thus can we maintain the rule of law and counter terrorism. Thank you.
Domnul Dzhambazki, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Dzhambazki, 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that the terrorist threats are one of the biggest challenges to European countries, and unfortunately terrorist organizations have been underestimated, radicalization has been underestimated, and actually multiculturalism has failed. Unfortunately, many countries continue with rather reckless policies towards countries such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar that sponsor terrorist organizations. It's time to put an end to this. And
signal here that interpreters.
As far as states funding terrorism are concerned, they should not be bailed out as we did with Turkey. Rather, they should be sanctioned. To those who organize terrorism, such as Saudi Arabia, sanctions should be imposed. Otherwise, terrorism will become an everyday happening in Europe. Thank you.
Domnul Ježek, 2 minute.
Mr. Ježek.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, terrorism is a threat to our lives, values, societies, and our way of living. The scope of the threat is broad and thus requires a European response in close cooperation with our partners around the world. On European response to the asymmetric war, it should focus, in my view, on the following issues: terrorism financing, internal and external security, and terrorism root causes. We must adapt our legislation to better prevent and track terrorism financing. It's not expensive to conduct attacks like in Paris. We need tightened rules on tools like prepaid cards and stricter anti-money laundering rules. Regarding ISIS, there are some 10 resources of its financing. We must strangle them all, starting with oil trafficking. Europe can't be unsecure. We must reinforce security measures at all levels, from local to EU-wide. Of course, they should be effective, but not excessive. At European level, cooperation between member states, their police and other law enforcement services is the key. We must not repeat the mistakes of the past. At the same time, we must better protect and control our external borders. The alert is high. It's crucial that all our border and coast guards and police know who enters and leaves Europe. External border control is also the best way to fight arms trafficking effectively and limit terrorists' access to arms. There is, however, a long-term task. Many radicalized people were born and raised in Europe, and then some became foreign fighters, and some conducted attacks against their own country. Teams with expertise and on-the-ground experience should develop integration projects which local authorities should then implement. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Ježek. Doamna Zuber, un minut.
Ms. Zuber, 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. President. The EU strategy to fight against terrorism is to restrict individual freedoms and democratic freedoms. There's a false dichotomy between freedom and security, and the vision that underpins it is militaristic, and that ultimately just strengthens the logic of war and hate. These measures that are being rolled out to undermine freedoms is part and parcel of the militarization of international relations and interference and war. And that leads to xenophobia, racism, and terrorism in Europe. Hideous crimes such as were perpetrated in Paris or across the world require policies based on peace, respect for international law, and which stop any interference in sovereign states, particularly in the Middle East. It is these that have led to the growth of terrorist groups. Thank you.
Albrecht, un minut.
Mr. Albrecht, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm delighted to hear the Presidency lining out most of what the Commission proposes, and I would be very happy if it would be possible to walk more quickly towards solutions on fighting terrorism than it was possible in the past, because it was member states who blocked many measures to set common standards in the area of criminal proceedings, of cooperation on organised crime and terrorism, especially on information sharing between institutions and authorities of the member states and the Europol or other agencies on the European level. And it's still not working. It's still not working, information sharing, especially when it comes to information on suspects, on risks. And that's what we need to strengthen, not gathering loads of data on individuals who are not relevant at all for investigators, but concentrating on the quick information exchange on those who are suspicious and those areas where there are risks. And that's also not only needed for effectiveness, but that's also needed because we are still in rule of law based democracies, and we have to respect the fundamental values which we defend here against the terrorists. And that has been reiterated just days ago by the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights with regard to a case in Hungary, that you always need to have a suspicion or risk to retain data on individuals. So we should stick to that and should strengthen that and not build on further information gathering measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Woolfe, 1 minut și 30 de secunde.
1.5 minutes.
Mr. President, thank you, Minister. The first rule of any government is the protection of its people. And the protection of the people of Europe from terrorism is at least something I recognise you understand as being serious. But in order to deal with the problem of terrorism, you must at first know who is your enemy and who are your friends. You must know where they share your values and where do they come from. And this is where the analysis of the European Union is failing. Because you have to understand the problem, you have to understand where they are, and you have to understand what they're doing here. And the first part of the problem, Minister, is that in the language of yourself and of the Commissioner, and I quote from yourself, you said the vast majority of migrants are fleeing terrorism. That, quite frankly, isn't true. We know the vast majority of migrants are economic migrants. The vast majority of asylum seekers are genuinely people fleeing terrorism. That is the first part of the problem you must address. And the second part of the problem you must understand is that the open borders that you have created and are not willing to challenge, you don't know who's come in, you don't know where they are, and you don't know how they get here. And that creates the last form of terrorism, the internal terrorism that the women in Cologne and Bonn and Berlin and Sweden and all of the parts of Europe that suffered over New Year's Eve will have to face. That's your problem.
Domnule Woolfe, acceptați...
Mr. Woolfe, would you accept a blue card question? Would you accept a blue card from Mr. Jakovčić?
Hvala vam lijepo, poštovani kolega, što ste prihvatili ovu plavu kartu. Waiting for translation. Okay. Thank you so much. Now it's better. Imate prijevod? No, imate prijevod.
No. Is it okay?
Is it okay? Ja bih htio, poštovani kolega, vezano za...
Thank you. Colleague.
In English, I'll try. I'm not sure that I'll be so good. But you said many things and I agree with you, but do you agree with me that the terrorism is a universal threat? Because we have terrorism also inside Europe. You know, you remember what's happened in Northern Ireland, what's happened in Germany, what's happened in Italy, and also in Norway or in other countries in Europe. It's our European problem. It's, let me say, European terrorism. We are not speaking only and just about the terrorism coming into Europe. So I think that terrorism is a universal threat for us. So, and I think that we have to combat with all types of terrorism. Do you agree with me?
Sir, may I add that your English is excellent in compared to my understanding and knowledge of your language, and I welcome that. You are quite right, sir, that terrorism is an international problem. It stretches and hurts and pains families across the globe. And yes, we have our own problems with individuals here, and we have that as a homegrown basis. But the issue that we're facing today is one of ISIS and that evil ideology that is attempting to turn man against man and woman against woman, and we have to have a solution, not just a European Union solution, but a global solution. That is the way forward and the only way that we can tackle it.
Doamna Maeijer, 2 minute.
Ms. Maeijer, 2 minutes.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you very much. Today we're talking about the increased threat of terrorism. And it seems to be a surprise to a number of you that Europe is the target of terrorism. This happens is because you still have the wrong analysis despite all the attacks we've seen. The West is under attack. And you're still analyzing it wrong, despite all the deaths you've seen. You're still saying that they're not getting their inspiration from the Quran, despite the fact that they're using the refugees to get into Europe. You're still treating this as hysteria. And the analysis seems to be that you still believe in multiculturalism. That shows that you don't understand the situation. Islamists are out to dominate the world, and there's another problem. We have a problem that we're not daring to name. We have the open borders which are flooding Europe with terrorists. And I don't understand why we're still doing that despite all the attacks. We had 31,000 asylum seekers coming into Greece the first month of this year, including, I'm sure, terrorists and future bombers. And they're exploiting Schengen. With borders like this, it's not possible to have security. It's not the question of whether there will be another attack. It's a question of when we can expect the next attack. So if you really take the increased terrorist threat seriously, and if you want to protect Europeans, then it's time that we accept that the only solution is to close our national borders and sending back all the so-called asylum seekers wherever they come from. That's the only way to stop Islamization of Europe.
Fountoulis, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Fountoulis. 1 minute. Europe has suddenly realized it's got a terrorism problem. And now, for a number of years, these organizations have been at work. Consider all all the young people that perished in Bataclan, and they were just out to have fun. European countries is allowed terrorism to come onto the streets of Europe. You've lost touch with reality. We're seeing racism and all sorts of other phenomena. And we need sensible ways to tackle terrorism. The mass media or terrorism end up having a Muslim face in Europe. That's what we've got to understand. We're here, and we can't be surprised what is happening to women and girls. Most people in Europe, most of those arriving in Europe are in fact terrorism. So what are we going to do against it? Because we've got to stop illegal people coming into Europe.
Caro Ministro, caro Commissario.
Minister, Commissioner, thank you very much for your words and the efforts that you're making together with us, members of the European Parliament, to deal with the problems we face with a long-term view. This is a major drama, this drama of terrorist violence in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, etc. The news at the moment is not comforting. And that is why, as a Parliament, we particularly would like to say that our policies on passenger name records, for example, and to try and be firm in defending our continent. And we want to be able to say that we're moving in the right direction, but we're not doing enough. We have many weaknesses, and they also relate to the issue of immigration. I agree that there is no cause and effect between migration and terrorism. These two issues should not be confused. They shouldn't be linked. But however, neither is it correct to deny that there may be common causes to these two phenomena. It is normally terrorists have an Islamic ideology, and I don't think it's wrong to say that. People are using the Quran as an excuse to produce violence, and we can't leave them to continue to do that. We should continue to attempt to bring democracy into those countries where it doesn't exist, because we shouldn't be doing that, because this is the main cause of these terrorist activities. Mrs. Fajon, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. More and more terrorist activities are taking place all over the world. Pakistan, Burkina Faso, and so on. In 2015, we are going to look back to this year with sadness. There's more and more terrorism. Young people born in Europe become terrorists. They are excluded and they fall victim to extremists. Terrorism is a threat to peace and world order, but it's very important to separate refugees and terrorists. The most refugees flee because of terrorism. There is no total security, and if we only deal with measures to increase security, we will fail. We have to supplement these with additional social measures, for example. We have to prevent radicalization. We have to battle the root causes. Europe needs a clear strategy on how to deal with returnees. Information exchange, yes, it's very important, and until this is taking place, no measure will be effective. That's why we have to build on trust. Member states have to be more active in information exchange. They have to track foreign fighters and terrorist cells. They have to track arms and other dangers to the EU. I'm surprised to see when the Council did not agree to obligatory information exchange on terrorists within the new PNR legislation. I think this could prevent many tragedies. We have to fight radical Muslim propaganda in social media. We have to empower parents, and we have to make sure that there are parental consents for minors to travel. We have to help victims, and we have to rehabilitate radicalized individuals. We have to fight terrorism with security measures and respect human rights. Thank you.
Would you accept a blue card from Mr. Ujadowski, who is up there? Okay. Yes. Okay.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Mr. President, Madam, as far as I remember, it was the socialists who did not want to speed up the work on the PNR directive. Today, we know that the Commission put forward a new proposal of directive, anti-terrorist directive, and it's a good directive. And I have a question to you, because you represent the socialist group. Are the socialists going to support the directive proposed by the Commission, or we will have the same blocking atmosphere as it was with PNR?
Thank you, colleague, for your question. At this point in time, I think it's very important to emphasize that information exchange is sorely needed, but we can't go too far. We can't impinge on our privacy too much. Yes, information exchange on terrorism and organized crime is important, so it's important to see what is in the proposal and how negotiations take place. Thank you.
Doamna von Storch, 1 minute.
Ms. von Storch, 1 minute. Thank you very much. Today we're talking about the increased terror threat. We had the attacks in Paris. We have also 838 attacks in Cologne. That was terror as well. We can't talk about terror without talking about migrants. We got 8 to 10 million thousand refugees on the way to Germany, we're being told. We're not saying they're all terrorists, but terrorists among them are abusing our open borders, and there are too many. Anybody who's responsible for open borders also is jointly responsible for their actions. Seehofen has said a lot in German. We've got CDU writing a lot of letters, and we've got the Chancellor. These are people who will go down in history as the destroyers of Europe, even though the Chancellor is soon going to resign. Thank you. Ms. Bakasatunda.
Thank you, President, Council and Commission have made a clear list of lists and agree on this. I mean, there's a clear list of tasks we need to do to tackle terrorism, and that's a good thing, and it's a good thing that you agree and that you've been consistent, but there are shortcomings here, and I think there are two main ones. First of all, it is a global threat, and so we need a global and joined up solution, and there are countries which aren't participating, for instance, on the databases or the exchange of information between intelligence agencies. That's a clear weakness. We're, or rather, terrorists are interconnected, and we need to be interconnected to fight them. The second shortcoming is early detection. Now, it's a global threat, but it acts locally. We've got to be far more focused and systematic. We've got to act on locally, identify good practices, and thereby avoid problems in the future. And you've got to work far harder on our main weakness, that's prevention and early warning at a local level. Thank you.
That's un blue card din partea domnului Szanyi.
Will you accept a blue card for Mr. Szanyi?
Right shoulder, over the right shoulder, your right shoulder, over there. Yeah, Mr. Szanyi.
Köszönöm szépen, elnök úr. Tisztelt képviselő.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam. You talked about two weaknesses or challenges. I think there's a third. Would you agree? Aren't you afraid that many governments are overreacting? Take, for instance, the Hungarian government. They're a good example. What would you say to this? What's your assessment of governments? Are governments in some cases overreacting? Are they not taking perhaps a more proportional reaction? Thank you, sir. I'm very pleased to ask this question. Now, obviously, one of the risks and temptations is governments in facing up to fanaticism and terrorism go beyond the law. And obviously we must act within the law. We must, of course, prevent any impunity, and we must always respect our fundamental rights and the rule of law, because otherwise we've lost the battle against terrorism. The fight to defend what we've achieved, the law, the rule of law. So no impunity, but the abuses. The abuses always boomerang on you. Thank you.
Doamna González, un minut.
Ms. González. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Fighting terrorism shouldn't mean a choice between our security and our fundamental freedoms. We need to increase the effectiveness of the state's activities and reaffirm our unquestionable commitment to democracy and our values, both within and outside our borders. We need to cut funding and the logistics networks for terrorists. We need to support democratic forces in the Arab world and support civil society in Syria and Iraq. We need to neutralize the networks that recruit people and improve the activities of our intelligence services. It is also our responsibility to protect refugees who are fleeing terror. In fact, the best way to fight extremism is to ensure that people feel part of a cohesive society and that they have economic and social opportunities. Many terrorists were born in Europe, and this can only be fought against by policies of social inclusion, also through education.
Sargentini, 1 minute.
Sargentini, 1 minute.
Dank u, voorzitter. Voorzitter, ik hoor de eurocommissaris.
Thank you very much. I hear the Commissioner talk about a proposal he wants to make to counter financing of terrorism. You've notified us of this a couple of times, but I'd like to know what the real objective is. If you look at the attacks in New York 9/11, they weren't very expensive. It's strange to hear me say that. The attack in Boston was on the cheap as well. The attacks in Paris were on the cheap. So exactly what are you intending to do? You need to cut back on the funding of Daesh in Syria. But we've just heard that they're going to cut back on the pay to their fighters. So what are we going to do? Are we trying to find a way of tracking the money? There isn't a lot of money, so it's not going to leave much of a track, so it's going to be different. Or are we going to try and choke off the money so that they can't make terrorist attacks? But given that these terrorist attacks are done on the cheap, I don't see how we can do that either. So I'd be interested to hear what you're actually aiming at.
The Arabic system of transferring the money. Doamna Ferrara, 1 minute.
Ms. Ferrara, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. There's been an increased terrorist risk, but we shouldn't pay a high price by reducing our freedoms and liberties to increase security. The threat is above all internal to Europe. It's not just an external threat. The responsibility to fight this belongs to member states, but the European Union can make a significant contribution. We need a coordinated and effective exchange of information. We need better dialogue between databases and national intelligence services, because otherwise the alternative is what we're seeing now, the reintroduction of controls at internal borders in the European Union. We need to improve the use of the tools that we already have. We shouldn't simply continue to gather more and more data. We need to politically isolate these terrorist organizations, cut their funding, etc. It's not impossible for us to achieve these results. We just need the political will to put all this in place. Thank you.
Domnul Buonanno, 1 minut și 30 de secunde.
Mr. Buonanno, 1.5 minutes.
Ringrazio anche.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank those representing the Dutch government as well. You know, when I speak, I'll get angry, I'll get annoyed, but it is a shame because there are 751 of us in this room. I mean, there are, in theory, but there are only 30 of us here. There are more officials than there are members here, and this is Europe trying to solve problems. I mean, we're talking about an extremely important problem here. I mean, goodness me, how can Europe act in this way? It's completely shameful. What can we say to the people of Europe when these attacks take place? I mean, we're just all crying crocodile tears. Look at what happened in Paris, London, Madrid, New York. And what do we stand up and say? I mean, we stand up and say, yeah, okay, you got Islamist terrorism. I mean, it's shameful. You know, how's this Europe going to fight terrorism? How's this Europe going to defend its people? This is a Europe of zombies. You are all zombies because those who are in charge have bulletproof cars, have bodyguards, they've got everything they need, but it's the people who come under attack, the citizens of Europe, and we say, well, it's Islam's fault, and then we give billions of euros to Turkey. We want Turkey as a member of Europe. I mean, Turkey is 90% Muslim, Islamic. I mean, I don't have a problem with Muslims, but we're Europeans, we're Westerns. We should stand up and show that we're tough.
You have 2 blue cards, Mr. Buonanno. 2 blue cards. Would you accept them? Okay, so first is Mr. Jakovčić. Mr. Jakovčić first, and then Mrs. Pagazaurtundua.
Grazie che avete accettato la mia carta blu. Lo dirò in italiano.
Thank you for having understood my blue card. I'll speak Italian for you. I think it's pretty hypocritical for you to turn up now in plenary and then, I mean, in a few moments you'll just head off. I'm here day after day, morning till night, and you just turned up just now for a couple of minutes, and your president, the president of your party is the same, Mr. Salvini. He turns up, he says there's no one here, and then he heads off. I mean, this is hypocrisy. You would surely agree with me on that.
A tutti quelli che applaudono.
Well, lots of you are applauding, but go and look at my data. Out of 751 members, I come 16th when it comes to presence in plenary, voting, etc. You don't have to say these things to me. I'm a serious worker. I'm 16th on the list. I'm also a trade unionist. I'm a mayor. I don't know what you do from morning to night, but I know what I get up to.
Cartonaș albastru din partea doamnei Pagazaurtundua.
A blue card from Mr.
Mr. Buonanno, with all due respect, have you ever met terrorism? I have. For 13 years I lived with a police escort. My brother was murdered by terrorism, and I can assure you, and what we don't need here is kicking up a fuss. We need to be focused and efficient. We need a spirit of cooperation. You talk about Europe as zombies. Well, look, I'm not a zombie. I've come here to work and to do everything I can and contribute everything, because I know how radicalism happens. I've known what terrorism is. I've worked on this issue. So please don't insult those of us who come here to work. We don't need 300 people saying stupid things. We need people being sensible. Well, sir, that was all terribly theatrical, but that's all it was.
Bene, io non ce l'avevo.
Okay, colleague, I don't have a problem with you. I mean, obviously the people who are here are working, and you're not the people I'm criticizing. Quite the opposite. I mean, what I get annoyed about is the people who are ruling Europe. They're people who will never be affected. You know, they'll never have their wife touched up by an Islamist in Cologne or whatever. I mean, that kind of thing won't happen to them. And all of those people who are applauding here, you know, the 4 monkeys, you know, get out there and do some work. Don't sit here and do nothing.
Trecem mai departe. Domnul Papadakis, un minut.
Let's continue. Mr. Papadakis, 1 minute.
Πλέον υπάρχει μεγάλη πείρα στους λαούς. Από τους Μουτζαχεντίν, τον Μπιν Λάντεν.
Thank you very much. The Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, Islamic State, they are all supported by the Gulf monarchies. They've been supported. They were used as a pretext to spread imperialist interventions. The Arab Spring led to a freezing cold winter, and now we are harvesting the fruits of imperialist intervention. It's terrorism and oppression that we are harvesting. The European Union wants to act against radicalism, but in principle, at the end of the day, all that we're seeing is people stocking up on arms, freedoms being restricted, and any opposition is going to be suppressed so as to allow capitalist oppression to continue. And it's only natural for the people to rise up against it.
Ms. Hohlmeier, 5 minutes. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to make a point of order. I would ask the President of this House to react when MEPs speak out against the heads of state and government and insult their wives and families. I expect you to say that that is not democracy. Now, terrorism is a major attack. I've had my own family threatened by terrorists. I know what the situation is. I know how people feel when they're threatened by terrorists. But this is a different kind of terrorism. This is targeted at people, any people who are not towing the line as far as ISIS, Islamic State are concerned. Anybody who goes to a restaurant, goes to a concert, is in a public square. And therefore, we must fight it. We must have better exchange of data. We've a lot of data protection, which was well meant, but we mustn't. We had a lot of data protection, but we must have more exchange now. We must have exchange data on a Eurodac so that terrorists can't hide in flows of terrorists. And if we've got a terrorist hiding somewhere, we've got to stop that person being able to fly into Europe. We also have to have mutual assistance on investigations. We have to extend that. We have to make sure that all the information goes into European data banks so everybody knows who is a criminal and so they can take action. The police have to be strengthened. They have to get more information. They have to fight these serious criminals day in, day out. And they deserve our support rather than just being lectured about everything they do wrong. Because when you're standing outside, it's very easy to judge people rather than when you're in the firing line and actually have to do. We need PNR, we need Europol. We need to have another look at all the issues which relate to data protection and the data protection package. We need to adopt these packages, and drying up the financing is one of many components. We have to do a lot of things. We have to stand together and work together to fight terrorism. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you accept a blue card?
Okay, Mr. Dzhambazki.
Thank you, President. Honourable colleague, what is your position on information in the media? Information delivered by German policemen. They said they had been ordered to hide crimes due to the descent of the perpetrators. I mean, what happened in Cologne in the night on the 31st of December.
First of all, it's a matter of investigating the crimes and discovering the nationality of the perpetrators. And if nationality is relevant to a crime, then it becomes part of the investigation. But I'm not first of all going to discover the nationality and then decide on the crime. And I don't allocate crimes depending on nationality. I want the crime to be investigated. There are too many Molenbeeks, there are too many no-go areas throughout Europe. There are too many areas where the police don't go in to investigate small crimes, and these are areas where democracy is destroyed.
Second blue card from Mr. Krasnodębski. Would you accept it? Okay.
Okay, I asked my question. Ja chciałem się panią
I would like to ask the following question. How would you assess the fact that what has happened in Cologne was not publicized in the media for several days? There was no public debate on these events. Mr. Dzhambazki said that, that the police was ordered to put information on hold, but in general, the public opinion in Germany and Europe-wide was not informed of these events. And how does that tally up with the issue that we're discussing here, the issue of terrorism? Thank you.
Es hat Kritik daran gegeben, dass ein
I think you should criticize the fact that there was one public broadcasting channel which only reports 2 days later, but most did report straight away. In Munich, it wouldn't have happened if you had. It didn't happen in Munich, but if you act against minor crime in good time, then this kind of thing happens. Then small criminals can't develop further. It's only when you don't do that that you get the major problems. Just need a minute, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. After the events in Paris, Europe is afraid of terrorism. That is entirely understandable, but in this situation, I think we need to keep calm, we need to keep a cool head and remember the importance of our fundamental values and liberal democracy. We mustn't allow populist parties to generate further fear, and certainly for them not to stir things up against certain communities. There are no terrorist threats that can justify restrictions to our fundamental freedoms. Now, out of fear of terrorism, there is a temptation to roll out measures that are against our culture and against our democracy. And that's, in fact, exactly what the terrorists want. That's exactly also what the populist extremists want. They want to destroy the free world that we've built up over the last 60 years. We believe that democracy and the fundamental rights must be protected. We're not going to get any result if people are or have their phones tapped or the like. We need more cooperation, and we need a common European secret service. These second, third generation immigrations shouldn't be allowed to become radicalized. Either education and training, integration, and a real future in Europe. These are the tools we really need to fight against terrorism. We must make it clear that integration in society isn't the same as cultural assimilation. But ultimately there's no alternative to that integrated society. That's the way to preserve our society.
You have a blue card from Mr. Jurek.
There's a blue card from Mr. Jurek. Do you accept?
Κύριε Jurek, 30 δευτερόλεπτα.
Please, 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear colleague, do you not believe that this language, populism, extremism, is a language of exclusion? It is hate speech related to millions of Europeans and their democratically expressed opinions and their democratically elected representatives. Do you really believe that if we continue talking in this language, we're able to build any sort of social dialogue about the major crisis that Europe is facing today and problems that we need to solve together? Thank you.
Στην μπλε κάρτα σας ανακοινώνω ότι δεν θα δέχομαι δεύτερη μπλε κάρτα στον ίδιο ομιλητή.
I'm not going to take a second blue card. I just want to tell you. Mr. Respond, please.
Thank you very much for that question. I think today's discussion is clearly illustrating what colleagues are really talking about: terrorism, a threat, and about prevention, and colleagues that want to instrumentalize this discussion to cry out against refugees, Islams and asylum seekers. I think in Parliament we don't need that kind of discourse. Here in Parliament we've got to focus on problems and about the objective facts. Thank you.
1 λεπτό, ο κύριος Nicholson.
1 minute now, Mr. Nicholson, please.
Thank you very much indeed, President. Can I first of all say that 2015 was brought back to us the serious problems we face with terrorism, and especially in Europe. And I think we have to face the reality that Europe has a serious problem with its borders, especially the Schengen borders. And I think that has got to be dealt with, because nowhere anymore in Europe is quite clearly safe, while we may like to think it is. Where I come from in Northern Ireland, we suffered over 4 decades of terrorism. I survived an assassination attempt myself, and I want to make it very clear in this House, I'm not a zombie. And those who talked like the way they talked in this debate, I think should really hang their head in shame. The victims of terrorism have been forgotten about time and time again. They are not thought about. They are forgotten about. You go on to the next atrocity, the next crime, and that's what cannot be allowed to happen. Can I say, above all else, we need in Europe good information exchange and cooperation right across borders and between all the police forces in Europe to combat this. Thank you.
Σας ευχαριστώ. Το λόγο έχει για 1 λεπτό.
Thank you. 1 minute now for Mrs. de Sarnez.
Merci. La menace terroriste.
Thank you. The terrorist threat is global, it's internal and external. And to deal with it, we need political will and we need unity. And we need to act. We need to act now, not tomorrow, not the day after, now. And there are 4 areas in which we need to act. We need to control and monitor our borders, like all great powers in the world, in an effective manner. We need to ensure that information exchange is obligatory between European countries. Thirdly, we need a European common defence policy, because the threat is at the gates of Europe. And fourthly, we need a strategy in the area of foreign policy. We need to try and solve conflicts such as those in Syria and Libya, for example. To conclude then, if we can do all of that as a group of 28, let's do it. If we can't act together, then some of us should get together. A few countries should take the initiative and move forward. And I hope that France and Germany will rediscover the aspiration and vision that is so cruelly lacking today in the European Union. Thank you.
Το λόγο έχει για 1,5 λεπτό η κυρία Ernst.
Thank you. Mrs. Ernst, now 1 minute.
Thank you very much. In Pakistan, we have armed threats and armed conflict against terrorism. And a lot of civilians are the victims. We talked to some children in Pakistan. They said they very much like it when it's not sunny, because when drones can't come in, there isn't a threat. if we see that people are more afraid of that than they are again of terrorists, then there's something wrong. Our anti-terror ministers are sometimes, not always, but sometimes just measures to try and scare off terrorists. They're not going to scare off Daesh. They're going to scare ordinary people, children in this case. And we're not going to make one step forward in the fight against terror if we fight fire with fire. What we need to do is to identify the sources of terror and dry them out. And I'm not just talking about the financial sources. In Saudi Arabia, for years, we've had transports of weapons for ISIS. We know that Turkey prefers to fight people other than ISIS or Daesh. We have to make sure that people don't support terrorists. We don't want a situation where the population supports Daesh because nobody else stands up for them. We've got to have reconciliation measures. We have to stand up for basic rights. And we don't want to weaken our society still further. Thank you.
Now, 1 minute for Mrs. James, please.
Let's be blunt about the current situation. The terrorist threat is effectively civil war. Incoming individuals joining already internally based dissidents, targeting key infrastructure to create maximum fear and disruption within our societies. We must, however, recognise that terrorists now control territory from which to export their violent ideology and have access to millions of dollars to fund their activities. But within the EU as well as the UK, their best resource, however, is Schengen. Borderless travel facilitates weapons, explosives and unfettered terrorist ideology exportation as well as people. And second only to Schengen is a banking network that facilitates the financing of terrorism. So, Commission, in your deliberations, face the facts. Isolate by ending Schengen and starve by taking steps to tackle the financing as two key means of combating this terrorism threat. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Polčák, 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I think that our response to terrorist attacks must be well balanced but also decisive and consequent. I appeal to you that before we introduce new laws in our legislative systems, we should first ask ourselves whether those that we already have are not sufficient. For example, I asked our Minister of the Interior about information exchange among countries, and there are many problems. For example, the Frontex agency sometimes records migrants several times, and I think we cannot be inactive because this plays into the hands of those who are enemies of our Christian Judaistic roots, and also supports then those who are against liberal democracy and who are against the European Union. I think that we have to defend our union of values, although it is very difficult to do and although perhaps it is disadvantageous from a short political point of view, short view. But I think that intolerance, prejudice, hatred, terrorism will never defeat free men. They will never break our values because they are well proved by history. As we have seen, extremist political forces in Europe receive financial support from Russia, something not to be overlooked. I think that we should be also decisive in this respect, and I do respect that we failed to use the opportunity to appeal to the Commission to investigate this question. This investigation is currently carried out by the American Congress, and I think we should do it as well. because unfortunately the main political representatives of Russia do not see Chechens or ISIS as their main enemies, but mostly our unity in Europe is their main enemy.
Η κυρία Revaud-Dallon Bonnefoy.
Mrs. Revaud-Dallon Bonnefoy, please. Thank you, President. Well, Member States can no longer act alone in the face of terrorism. The European Union needs to coordinate anti-terrorism policies because it's the security of the European Union that's at stake. The S&D Group calls for more Europe to fight terrorism. That means the systematic sharing of information between intelligence services, police services, etc. Europol needs to become a full European agency in its fight against terrorism. Fighting terrorism also means dealing with the funding of terrorism. We need to harmonise and exchange information between financial counter-terrorism units. We need to make progress there as quickly as possible. To conclude, to deal with the increasing recruitment of young Europeans by Islamic State, we need to deal with terrorism at its roots. We need a systemic policy to prevent radicalisation. Europe and its member states need to earmark more resources to deal with for preventive measures at the local and regional level in schools, businesses, etc., and also on the internet. Our policies need to show that all our young people are part of our societies. We need to recall our values of solidarity to all religions, including the Muslim religion, all the religions that make up the European community. Thank you. Mr. Krasnodębski now, please.
Σηκώνετε την κάρτα, την μπλε, λίγο πριν τελειώσει ο προηγούμενος ομιλητής. Οι συνεργάτες...
And please, you need to raise...
Thank you very much, President. I wanted to say that I do agree with colleagues who were saying that terrorism is also an intra-European threat. ISIS at the moment is supported by every 10th inhabitant of the United Kingdom and every 6th in France. It also seems that ISIS enjoys less support in the Arab countries than the European countries. The countries who send the largest number of fighters, apart from Albania or Uzbekistan, is, for example, Belgium, where the European institutions are present, and France, and also Switzerland. And this is what we should reflect upon. The main target of recruiting are young people without proper values, children of immigrants in the second or third generation, very often also people who have did not manage to take root in a new society. The same goes for patchwork families, children from patchwork families, people who want stability, moral code to follow, moral values, and they are very easily drawn to religious fundamentalism.
Έχετε μια μπλε κάρτα, you have a blue card from Mrs. Voutmans. Do you accept it? Κυρία Voutmans, έχετε το λόγο. Για 30 δευτερόλεπτα.
30 seconds, please.
Meneer de voorzitter, wel collega.
Thank you very much. You referred to Belgium, which is my country, and you sound like all foreign fighters are sent from our countries. That's not true. There are, of course, foreign fighters being sent from our country, but we'd like to know what you would do to solve the problem for the whole of Europe, because this is a problem for the whole of Europe. What would you do to stop young people from Europe going off and fighting a war that is not theirs?
Κύριε Krasnodębski, έχετε 30 δευτερόλεπτα για την απάντηση.
Proszę pana, najpierw bym się
Thank you.
First of all, I would get acquainted with the problem. So I have a proposal for all of you. Very often we take long hours to work in the European Parliament, and very close by, a few kilometers away, there are districts very close to the European Parliament where people gather who are there to plot an attack. Maybe we should just make an excursion one day, go there all of us and see the reality on the ground, and then we would have a real reality check, because reality check is a basis for a proper diagnosis and then to finding a solution to the problem you're talking about.
Η πρότασή σας, κύριε Κρασνοντębski, προκάλεσε μια νέα παρέμβαση από την κυρία.
Your proposal has meant that someone else wants to ask a blue card question.
I would like to invite the colleague to come along with me. We have to my commune, Mechelen, where we have a liberal mayor, we involve people into society so they feel included. So come with me next week. I invite you to come with me to Mechelen and see how we tackle the problem. Anybody else who wants to come, you're very welcome.
Okay. You can deal with the rest of this discussion outside plenary, I think. Mrs. Gomes, please.
How can we protect our citizens against the threat of terrorism and against organised crime? And they do join up. What we have now can't come as a surprise and must... and this is something that we must fight together, because on its own countries can't do it. We're paying the price of a lack of coordination in Iraq, in Libya, in Palestine. We need to attack the funding of terrorism, and that's trafficking in drugs, people, oil, including by so-called allies of us, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar. We need to coordinate what we do and support people fighting on the ground, such as the Peshmerga, and we must also help out refugee populations so they can go back to areas of such as Sinjar, because it's not by closing borders and by getting rid of Schengen that we will end the barbarity of this. We are seeing disunion and a lack of trust. We refuse to share information or fighting, and we don't fight against terrorism. We didn't get PNR terrorism. We've got to do something to fight against recruitment and also fight against neoliberal policies which lead to more wars. We must also prevent radicalization of young people in Europe who join the ISIS from our borders and indeed even within our prison. So there's a complete lack of organization, and we're also helping terrorism by this terrible wave of xenophobia against people who are fleeing war. We don't need to invent anything, we just need political will. We need to understand shared strategic interests. We live in a world of the rule of own interest rights. The solution is a coherent, joined up approach to our domestic and external policies. Governments need to work together. This is a European problem, and the main weapon we need, the main arm, is union, European Union. Thank you.
Mrs. Gomez, there's a blue card for you from our colleague Duxtorf. Do you accept that? Please.
Herr talman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to know what Ana Gomez has to say about what we discussed when we heard from the last speakers. There was a reference to Sweden, where we have a lot of young people who've gone off to fight with ISIS. Integration and a better distribution of refugees be a way to deal with this. If your homeland took more refugees, we might have less of this kind of activity. What do you think, Ms. Gomez?
Well, my country has actually volunteered to accept up to 5,000 refugees in these coming months, and they are not coming because the system is not working. But those who have come are actually indeed properly supported to be socially integrated, and having, for instance, access to work is very important, apart from other aspects, to actually work according to the rules in our society. Social inclusion is the most important thing, and actually all the policies, all the neoliberal policies who have been only fostering social exclusion and discrimination, and in particular in communities of migrants, is actually what has been helping the terrorists recruit young people in our borders and to fight abroad, but as well against us.
Σε ευχαριστώ. Θερμή παράκληση και η ερώτηση και η απάντηση να μην υπερβαίνουν τα 30 δεύτερα.
Thank you. Please stick to your 30 seconds when you're replying to a blue card, please. 1 minute, Mrs. Trebesius.
Allein in Deutschland.
Thank you very much. In Germany alone, we've had tripling of terror cases over the last year. There are more and more cases against people who support ISIS. Many of them have come to us through the streams of terrorists, of refugees, sorry. On the 7th of January, the anniversary of the Charles Hebdo attacks, a person was shot in Paris who had attacked some policemen. He had been identified as somebody who had lived in Germany and had 7 different identities. He was registered as a Georgian, Tunisian and other nationalities. He'd committed a number of crimes in other countries, including sexual attacks, violence, and so on and so forth. The walls of his flat were decorated with ISIS symbols, but nevertheless he was able to move throughout Europe. So my country, Germany, is a weak link.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Mr. Weidenholzer.
Now, terrorist attacks are going to happen more often, they're going to be more effective, and they're going to destabilize our fundamental values, and they'll continue to endanger the European Union. The fight against terror is essential. We must devote all our attention to it. Now, it has a name, Daesh, ISIS. We've got to talk about these. We shouldn't allow this discussion to be hijacked for empty polemics. And there's a lot of talk, but not enough efficient action. We adopted 2 measures, much discussed here. One was the report on de-radicalization and EU PNR. I don't know whether they'll be implemented or not, but anyway, we have adopted these measures and they should be. We've got to consider whether the data is properly prepared and analyzed. We need more and better trained police officers, and we also need to consider why national intelligence services hold onto the information rather than cooperate. I know that we can't force them to, you can't, Commissioner, but we've got to find a way to get the intelligence services to share the information. They've got to work with each other and share information, and I think that would be the most important step to take in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. López Aguilar, 1 minute. Thank you.
Děkuji, pane předsedo.
En el año 2004. Por tanto, la pregunta no es si nos van a volver a golpear, sino dónde y cuándo. Y lo harán contra todos nosotros, la ciudadanía de una civilización regida por el derecho y de libertades que es Europa, que no puede ser sacrificada en el altar de una seguridad nacional descoordinada. Por tanto, hay que saber usar la cabeza fría con sensatez, como se ha dicho, y no cometer el error de pensar que la extranjería, la inmigración o los refugiados, sin más, son una amenaza contra la seguridad, ni tampoco, por supuesto, que el pánico o el miedo sean una respuesta. No lo es. El camino correcto es completar Schengen, la Guardia Europea de Fronteras. El camino correcto es una comunidad europea de inteligencia con información compartida. El camino correcto es completar el derecho penal europeo y una agencia europea de policía y la protección de las víctimas del terrorismo. Y finalmente, tener muy claro que no hay que ceder.
Κύριε Αγγιλάρ, συγγνώμη γιατί έχω ένα πρόβλημα με τη διερμηνία.
Mr. Aguilar, the interpretation has been a problem, but now you can carry on.
Σας δώσω το χρόνο, συνεχίστε.
There was a problem earlier, but please carry on now. I'll give you an extra 30 seconds.
May I proceed?
You can carry on.
You can proceed.
El camino, además.
The proper path to take is to be aware that the jihadization of social exclusion means that we need a European fight against marginalization and inequality. There are communities that have been particularly affected by austerity, and that has aggravated the inequalities in Europe, and that is the background to this increased marginalisation and exclusion, and that has led to many Europeans who are born in Europe and who are European residents to carry out European terrorist attacks in Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez Aguilar. Now Mr. Mamikins, 1.5 minutes.
Decades ago, different parts of Europe were plagued by internal conflicts with various nationalistic groups. These times are over. The advent of the globalization age has removed any meaningful boundaries. Terrorism is no longer limited to any borders. It is both global and much more radical than even before. And unlike in Northern Ireland or Spain, there can be no peaceful resolution. The only reasonable way to combat the current wave of radicalization in Europe, including active propaganda and ISIL membership, is a complete overhaul of the existing policies on integration, judiciary and prosecution, security of financial transactions, as well as counter-propaganda in case of those susceptible to such radicalisation. Not to mention a more assertive foreign policy in relation with those who openly or allegedly contribute to these processes. I mean Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar or anyone else. I am not proposing to forsake ourselves and abolish our core values. Our first and foremost objective is to guarantee the safety to our citizens, not endanger them even more. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ. Ολοκληρώσαμε τον κατάλογο των εγγεγραμμένων ομιλητών. Προχωρούμε στη διαδικασία.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our speakers list. I have 6 requests under Catch the Eye. This is a very interesting debate, so I've agreed to let all 6 speakers take the floor. Mr. Bogovic, you have 1 minute, please.
Thank you. First of all, we have to clearly say what the main reasons for this spread of terrorism are. First of all, many young Europeans are disappointed. They have no future. There are ghettos developing in big cities around Europe, and these are the places where terrorism thrives. We have to deal with the fact that Libya, Iraq, Syria and Afghanistan lost the dictatorships, and that destabilized this region. The Islamic State and some Arabic countries finance terrorism, and they are the ones who also finance terrorist attacks in Europe. We have to ensure information exchange. We have to make sure that our intelligence agencies cooperate. We have to deal with the root causes of terrorism. You have to be smart, and you should not attack honest Europeans like you do in the firearms directive, because we are forgetting that it's the illegal trade that is the cause of terrorism.
Όχι, το αίτημα για μπλε κάρτα ήρθε με τη λήξη της ομιλίας, δεν το δέχομαι, νομίζω...
Right, I'm not going to take any more blue cards because we have concluded that part of our debate. In any case, though, you do need to raise your blue card before the person's speech has finished speaking, the person who you want to ask the question of. It's now catch the eye. Mr. Grappini, you have the floor, please.
Comisar, în perioada de criză se probează cel mai bine.
Commissioner, President, in a crisis, you see whether organizations can stand up to the crisis, so same as in the family. Europe needs to put a priority, so Council Commission need to put a priority to security of our citizens. We heard from the Minister we've got to fight against hatred against Islamism, or rather Muslims. But what can you do to get people to accept our culture if they've been forced to leave their countries for economic and wars? You know, we've got to help to integrate. There's also got to be better European level communication. Council and Commission need to present a clear plan to address the refugee crisis and the flow of economic migrants. We can't allow member states to deal with these issues on their own. The European Commission and Council need to come forward with a clear, joined-up plan based on solidarity, because we can't allow security to be undermined any further.
Mrs. Marias now, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Combating terrorism obviously means that we need to look at the origins of terrorism. Young people are radicalized, and this is a social phenomenon. We have to recognize and look at how European countries have behaved in the Arab world since 2011. Integration of Muslims in our societies is also an issue. But we also have hate speech, and that must be combated. And in principle, the outcome is that we have a clash of cultures. When it comes to relationship with African countries and North Africa, we need to keep an eye on that.
Now, Mr. Marinho Pinto, 1 minute.
Κύριε Φαρία, θα πάρετε και εσείς το λόγο. Θα πάρετε και εσείς το λόγο. Θα πάρετε και εσείς. Θα μιλήσετε και οι δύο.
I'll give you the floor too, don't worry.
Μην ανησυχείτε.
Don't worry, you'll both get the floor. Everyone will get the floor who asked.
That you will speak all together. After two speakers. Παρακαλώ, κύριε Μαρίνιο Επίντου, έχετε το λόγο για 1 λεπτό.
Mr. Marinho Pinto.
Thank you, President. The fight against terrorism begins with the fight against racism, xenophobia, and any type of fanaticism. And thereafter, what follows is a fight to support democracy, the rule of law, individual freedoms, particularly the freedom of movement of all European citizens. That's the Europe I believe in, the Europe I've fought for. As George Steiner said, this is a Europe that is a daughter of Hellenism, Athens, but also the daughter of Jerusalem and the 3 religions of the book. A cultural Europe founded on the 3 religions of Jerusalem, that is to say, Islam, Christianity, and the Jewish faith. Islamism has sought to exterminate many of its citizens, and it's also sought to kill many Jews. Terrorism wants to segregate, persecute, and expel Muslims as well. Minister, Commissioner, the fight against radicalization, which is very that's got to begin with the fight against intolerance, which is spreading so dangerously within Europe.
Thank you. Mr. Dzhambazki asked for a blue card, but you've already had the floor, haven't you? Put your headphones on, please. Please sit down, put your headphones on. I was saying that you've already taken the floor. You've already had a go during this debate. This is the catch the eye procedure, so I can't give you the floor again, blue card or otherwise, because those who weren't on the list have now got an opportunity to speak. So please don't insist on your blue card, please. Now we have Mrs. Tomašić, 1 minute.
Hvala lijepa. 2015. su obilježili teroristički napadi u izvedbi islamske države.
Thank you. 2015 was marked by terrorist attacks carried out by Islamic State and its sympathizers. According to recent reports from our intelligence services, unfortunately 2016 will be no more peaceful. Now, we don't need to panic about that, but neither should we be pleased about it, of course. Europe needs to increase security measures to ensure that our citizens are secure, and our security forces need to have the green light to intervene early against those who are plotting terrorist attacks on our territory. International cooperation needs to be increased as well. The appropriate bodies in member states need to agree and coordinate their actions without having their activities interfered with by supranational authorities whose competences haven't properly been defined. We need to be rapid and efficient on this, because the security of our citizens is at stake, and that should be our priority. So I hope that future decisions from the Council and Commission will go along these lines. Thank you. Mr. Faria.
Thank you, President. The attacks in Burkina Faso and Turkey following on those in 2015 clearly show that the terrorist threat is transnational, and of course their aim is universalist, and that's important to understand to fight against them. In the fight against terrorism, the European Union mustn't just beef up military and security cooperation, but also must tackle radicalization as well as the sources of funding, and also provide healthcare to those that are fighting for our civilization values. Colleagues, that's why it's a disgrace to hear from Peshmergas that they need hospital care in Europe, but they've had to pay what they've received in Europe because the European Union has been unwilling to help. Once again, I appeal to you. We shouldn't sacrifice human rights in the fight against terrorism, and refugees that come, that become the collateral victim of terrorism should not bear the brunt of this terrible crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Faria. Well, that concludes our speakers list, and we've also concluded our Speak the Eye procedure. So now, on behalf of the Commissioner Avramopoulos, you have the floor, sir.
Έλεγα να αποφασιστώ τις ευκαιρίες για να θυμηθώ λίγο τα ελληνικά μου, το γεγονός ότι προεδρεύεται.
Thank you very much. I've finally got the opportunity to remember my native tongue, but I will speak in English.
I am following this debate with great interest, as you understand. I want to express from the very beginning my thanks for your full support to our engagement and our commitment to fight terrorism. This is a topic that leaves no one indifferent or uninterested, and I believe that in this room we really foster a common consciousness beyond the fact that we are committed politically to fight terrorism. Ms. Sargentini, I would like to answer to your question, which is of great importance, although in the beginning, in my introductory remarks, I was very clear on that. Terrorist attacks, even the ones that are not organized by the wider network, it is true to say that they cost money. Money for equipment, for logistics, for falsified documents. I want to assure you that we shall follow that money to help the prevention, support the prevention and investigation of terrorist attacks. Soon we shall come back in order to discuss this issue further. I don't think I need to demonstrate or prove once more our commitment to the fight, as I said at the beginning, against terrorism and the security of our citizens. I think we can all agree that much progress has been made to deliver our European agenda on security. But we are, of course, not there yet, as long as the terrorist threat is still there, is out there. The threat we face is tangible, and we need actions that can make a difference at all levels of our societies. We need each other to achieve results. European Union institutions, Member States' governments, national, but also the authorities at the local level, law enforcement authorities, intelligence services, but also civil society. I would like to come back to what I said in the beginning. Member States they need to trust each other more. They need to share more information between themselves, but also with Europe. On a personal basis, I can tell that I'm not happy with the cooperation so far. Unfortunately, most of the Member States, sorry to say that like this, but they keep the best of the information for themselves. It is the moment to make a step forward. Our work is not over. The Commission will enhance and redouble its efforts in this area in 2016. Concrete actions are on the horizon, particularly as regards terrorist financing. I really count on your support in these efforts. We need to move forward quickly and effectively with European solutions to the common European problem of terrorism. Thank you very much for your attention, and once again, thanks for your support to our efforts.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, let me give the floor to Minister Koenders on behalf of the Council, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wanted to thank the members of the European Parliament for a very interesting debate on terrorism. Let's start by saying that terrorism is a very multifaceted monster that requires a range of answers. There's not one simple answer to the threat of terrorism. And I fully understand today also the range of emotions that we have in this Parliament on this issue. Let's first of all remember all the victims and their families and their children, and I take that very seriously. And in honor of them, let me assure you that not only the Council is very active on ensuring that we cooperate better, I will say something about that in a second, but I would also really caution against using the issue of terrorism for simple political agendas, be they from one side or from the other. If we are not united in the fight against terror, and understanding that it is a very complex phenomenon with an octopus where we have to work on prevention and repression, on law enforcement and sharing, on trust between countries, on fighting the Islamic State. If we're not working on that together, and we just make this an element of political agendas, then we are not going to move forward, I can tell you that. And I just wanted to tell you one thing as well. I was hearing the word political elite. I think Mr. Buonanno was saying that. I'm representing here the Council, not the Dutch government, but a Council which is based on governments of different political persuasions. And for me it's very difficult to hear, I think you probably make 100,000 euros a year, I don't know, with all due respect, parliamentarians and ministers make money, but if you are part of the political elite, then I am as well. And it's not one of us who has the right to be talking on behalf of the people more than others. Everybody is working, so am I, We are representing our people. We might have different views, but we're not going to have this debate on the basis of simplifications. We cannot accept that. The issue of terror is much too complicated for that. And let me say as well that if we are cool-headed and we dare to analyze what is going on and we cooperate, then together we can move. But if we are going to work on divisions, that's exactly what the terrorists want from us. Namely that we divide ourselves and that what is actually a terrorism, namely a strategy that wants to inspire fear in the population and among the politicians, then we're actually not going in the right direction. So I would say, let's be cool-headed. Let's think through what we have to do. And yes, that is prevention. And yes, that is repression. And yes, that is working together. And yes, that is fighting the Islamic State. It is, first of all, I think the Commissioner said that very correctly. And that is also what the Council is trying to do. We had a conference 10 days ago in the Netherlands, which was based on the anti-ISIS coalition and the global coalition against terrorist fighters. What is the issue there? The issue is that we have to combine trust, share and stop. We have to trust each other in ensuring that exchange of information is taken place. And why is that not always happening? And why should it happen more? And everybody said that here. And I think the Council is in agreement with this. But it's very understandable to know why we just say we have to share information. That means, and that was the lesson from last week, a cooperation between law enforcement, between intelligence, between civil society and others. And it is a working method and we have to improve and increase and strengthen it. The strongest answer of our societies is, first of all, as I said, resilience. Resilience and to believe in our values, which are based on democracy and rule of law. That's not just to applaud it. It's the only way to fight terror. And then come with very concrete answers. And let me say a few things on that. Because in the end, it's implementation. I agree with that. We can have all these debates. The Council is working in different settings to strengthen our cooperation. Let me say that it's important that we reached an agreement between the Parliament and the Council last December on PNR. Like the majority of MEPs in the Libe Committee, the Council is confident that an EU PNR will have a major impact on detecting terrorist suspects. The European Union has already adopted a number of measures for the collection and exchange of personal data between law enforcement authorities, and the transfer and processing of PNR data aims to complement the existing tools. Organised crime and terrorist activities involve international travel and finance. This includes the smuggling of persons or drugs or the access of terrorists to training camps outside the European Union. PNR data will allow law enforcement authorities to identify persons who were previously not suspected of being involved in organised crime. And I'm aware, I think Madam Hohlmeier also brought it up, about the link between the agreement on the PNR directive and on data protection directive. And I'm aware of the concerns. I share them. Also President Schulz has relayed them to us, and on which we have replied to him. Our two institutions, of course, agree on the need to ensure that this vitally important legislation will be adopted and enter into force as soon as possible. You can be assured that the Council has already taken and will, of course, continue to take all action required to ensure that these files are adopted with all due diligence, while also ensuring that their translation and legal linguistic revision are conducted in such a manner as to render the text as clear, consistent and legally sound as possible. And I'm sure that our institutions will continue to work as closely as possible, you have my commitment on this, to ensure that no avoidable delay occurs in the conclusion of these crucial dossiers. We have reached agreement on both files as PNR and data protection. Let me assure you, we will not backtrack on our commitments. I said already something about the need to cooperate, obligatory or not. That's, I think, in my view, not the issue. Of course, we know that under Article 4.2 of the TEU, national security remains the sole responsibility of each member state. There is accordingly no legal basis for an EU intelligence agency. It doesn't mean that there are not enormous needs to do this element of trust, share and stop. And I think we are in the context of working in many different councils that I sit on this. Let me also assure those who are worried about this, that we're constantly talking about balance. So if anybody who wants to have a simple agenda between privacy and repression, between thinking that it's all the Quran or it has nothing to do with fundamentalist tendencies, it's Islam, go ahead. It will not solve the issue. I think the Council is working on a combined effort on prevention and repression, and of course it is important to take very seriously the issues of rule of law and of our values, because that's exactly what is being attacked. So the way we fight these awful scores has to be within the limits, and that's why we are constantly continuing on this issue. That means, yes, that means also prevention. That's not a soft policy, that's a very hard policy. It is ensuring that people do not get radicalized. And that also has to do with economic opportunity and discrimination. Not only. It's not a defense. It's just that if we want to be effective, we have to look at the whole chain of radicalization and de-radicalization. I'm telling you, the stopping of the closing of frontiers is not an answer to that. Everybody, the same person who said we need to we close the frontiers, says at the same moment we need more international cooperation with the rest of the world. Let's do that. When we were meeting last week, it includes countries that are aware of this issue, that we have to strengthen our cooperation also in the intelligence field, as I mentioned, countries in North Africa and elsewhere. I would say that the timetable for our cooperation, and that is why I think it's important we have these debates regularly, we have, and I feel that also the necessity that we as an executive are being controlled by our national parliaments, but also with the debate here, that of course we are faced with, if you wish, an enemy that has quite possibilities to move around and has nothing to do with borders, but within our societies and internationally. And therefore we have to step up our efforts, we have to share in the trust and to make sure that the divisions we have, which are legitimate, but at the same time don't lead to lack of effectiveness against the threat of terror. Thank you very much.
Η συζήτηση έληξε. Το επόμενο σημείο στην...
That concludes the debate. The next item on the agenda is an oral question on the opening of free trade negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. First of all, I'll give the floor to Mr. Lange for 5 minutes. You put the question.
Ja, danke schön, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Commissioner, in the new trade strategy we heard and read that the global chain of added value particularly play out in the Asia and Pacific region, and that this is extremely important in world trade. Now, in the light of the conclusion of the Pacific Agreement with the US and 11 partners, the GPP, it is very logical for us, given our relationship with Australia and New Zealand, it's very logical for us to go down that road as well. A workshop was held by the European Parliament on this subject, and we looked very closely at the idea of trade agreement with New Zealand and Australia. Now, in saying that, it's obviously clear that on the one hand we have a very close value relationship with New Zealand and Australia. We have similar democratic structures, and we are marked by the same and similar economic structures, so there's a big core of common values. Australia is number 21 in terms of our trade partners. New Zealand is 51st, so they're not 100% central, if you like, but at the same time there are some very sensitive sectors, particularly in the agricultural sector, milk, sugar. We've had lengthy discussions about that, but also when it comes to meat, genetically modified issues, and we've got sheep and sheep meat. And then when it comes to geographic origin, that is dealt with differently in Australia and in Europe. However, we are on the way towards global rules, and that is absolutely essential in the light of increasing globalization in our world. And I'm convinced, and the committee is convinced, that these rules can't both be defined with like-minded countries with democratic structures. That being so, I'm convinced that when we discuss with New Zealand and Australia, we can be more ambitious than was the case with the Trans-Pacific Agreement of the US. We haven't carried out a scoping exercise yet. We need a closer analysis of the knock-on effects of such a trade agreement, and particularly we need to look at the capacities of the European Commission. And perhaps this is something you could look at, Mr. Commissioner. This year, for the first time, this year was the first time that there was a cutback in the staff of DG Trade. And given the situation, we have that situation is going to be very difficult to meet the challenges. I think trade policy is central to European Union policy, and therefore we need a sensible level of staffing of DG Trade. We represent the interests of EU citizens and the EU. We need transparency, and therefore we asked an oral question. And on the 2nd of February, there will be a resolution appended to that. The question is, why are negotiations starting now? What risks are there in the light of TPP? And what would be the consequences of an agreement with Australia and New Zealand? What would be the consequences in the Asian and Pacific area? And what role does the time component play? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lange. Good morning, colleagues. I'll give the floor to Mr. Mimica on behalf of the European Commission.
President, honourable members, Australia and New Zealand are the European Union's like-minded partners, partners with whom we share so much.